The yeas are 254, the nays are 173. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the engrossment of H.R. 3521, the clerk be authorized to correct section numbers, punctuation, and cross-references, and to make such other technical and conforming changes as may be necessary to reflect the actions of the House.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourn to meet at 9 a.m. tomorrow.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Members, please take their conversations off the floor. Members, please clear the aisles. The House will be in order. Members, please take their conversations off the floor. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Mr. Speaker, I offer a motion to instruct on H.R. 3630.
The clerk will report the motion.
Motion to instruct conferees on H.R. 3630 offered by Mr. Bishop of New York. Mr. Bishop of New York moves that the managers on the part of the House at the conference on the disagreeing votes of the two houses on the Senate amendment to the bill H.R. 3630 be instructed to file a conference report no later than February 17, 2012.
Pursuant to Clause 7 of Rule 22, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Bishop, and the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, this motion to instruct conferees is very simple and straightforward. It directs conferees negotiating extensions of the payroll tax cut, unemployment insurance, and the SGR to file their conference report by February 17, 2012. Day in and day out, members of this body come to the floor to speak about the level of uncertainty that is hindering the U.S. economy and stifling job growth. We have heard Speaker Boehner argue that the Bush tax cuts must be extended in perpetuity to relieve corporations of uncertainty. We have heard our Tea Party friends rally against the deficit in order to reduce uncertainty for job creators. Time and time again, we've heard our Republican colleagues speak of the uncertainty that EPA regulations have created for expanding jobs. Yet, when we contemplate the uncertainty created for consumers, small businesses, doctors, and the unemployed, driven by Congress's inability to address the payroll tax extension, the SGR fix, and unemployment benefits, our Republican friends are suddenly silent. We all remember the debate in December when, after years of touting the benefits of tax cuts, our Republican colleagues suddenly changed their minds when a payroll tax cut was considered, a tax cut that will provide immediate relief for millions of Americans and will immediately benefit the economy. As we've debated these issues for several months, we've seen the data and heard from economists who say extending the payroll tax cut and unemployment insurance is good for American families, businesses, and economic growth. It isn't the silver bullet to solving all of our nation's problems, but it's a step in the right direction, a step that can provide some relief to the unemployed and stimulate consumer spending, which is fundamental to improving the overall economy. By extending the payroll tax cut through the end of the year, 160 million Americans would continue to take home more money in their paycheck. For a family earning $50,000 a year, that's about $80 a month, or about $1,000 for the year. Without the extension, that $1,000 is unavailable to families for buying groceries or putting gas in their vehicles or buying their children new clothes for school, which when spent at local businesses sparks economic activity. These facts are indisputable. Moody's Analytics estimates that for every dollar spent on the payroll tax cut, it produces $1.27 in economic activity. J.P. Morgan Chase economists also estimated that ending the payroll tax cut and halting an extension of unemployment would shave 0.75% off the GDP next year. Macroeconomic advisors provided a similar analysis last year, stating that allowing the payroll tax cut to lapse would reduce GDP growth by 0.5% and cost the economy 400,000 jobs. A job loss of that magnitude would destroy the improvements in employment we've seen since President Obama took office. Last week, the Labor Department reported that 243,000 jobs were added to the economy in January, marking the 23rd consecutive month of private sector job growth. The unemployment rate also fell to 8.3%, the lowest point since February of 2009. Now, we clearly still have a long way to go. But failure to extend these critical programs would stifle the progress we have seen thus far and thwart future growth. But Americans don't know if they'll have that extra $80 a month to spend come March 1st, and businesses are equally uncertain about whether or not their customers will have that extra income to spend. Yesterday, Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, told the Joint Economic Committee that it is vital to extend both the payroll tax cut and unemployment insurance, which together could add 0.9% to GDP if done for the whole year. He also said that failure to do so would deal, quote, a significant blow to the economy, cutting growth by almost 1 full percentage point. We must extend both the payroll tax cut and unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance provides temporary relief to Americans who lose their jobs through no fault of their own. In a sense, it's a bridge to reemployment. The average weekly benefit in 2011 was $300 a week. That's $1,200 a month. Take that away, and millions of unemployed Americans lose a lifeline to put gas in their tank to get to that job interview or to hire a babysitter while they go out to look for a job. Every little bit helps to get them back on their feet, and that's all Americans want to do, get back to work. In every recession since 1957, the federal government has stepped in to provide additional support for unemployed workers. Without an extension, 5 million people will exhaust their benefits by the end of 2012. Furthermore, under the GOP proposal in December to adjust the unemployment program, 3.3 million people would lose their unemployment benefits. The Council of Economic Advisors estimates that if unemployment benefits are not extended, the economy can be expected to generate 478,000 fewer jobs, that's fewer jobs, by the end of 2014, an estimate that is consistent with CBO projections. CBO also estimates that $36 billion spent on unemployment insurance would raise GDP between $14 billion and $54 billion, or about 0.22%. The Economic Policy Institute has also estimated that extending unemployment through next year would create $70 billion in economic activity and a 0.4% increase in GDP. While these estimates differ somewhat, they all point to one thing: increased economic activity. Yet here we are, debating whether or not this vital lifeline should be extended for an additional 10 months. For struggling families, this is a frightening time to find our elected leaders squabbling about the Keystone Pipeline and requiring drug testing for unemployment benefits. As American families continue to struggle, so too do American businesses. A survey done in 2011 by the National Federation of Independent Businesses found that 53% of small businesses said lack of demand is an impediment to growth. Extending the payroll tax cut and unemployment will put additional money in the hands of Americans who will in turn spend that money on necessities like food, clothing, and travel. When consumer spending represents roughly 70% of our economy, the policies that create the environment for growth will be the ones that get Americans spending again, and we can do that by putting more money back into the pockets of Americans struggling to make ends meet. It's not just American workers and the unemployed facing uncertainty. Medicare doctors and patients are too. If we don't act, the SGR formula responsible for Medicare physician payments will cut reimbursements by 27.4% starting on March 1st. A cut this large will force more doctors out of Medicare at a time when doctors find it difficult to treat Medicare patients, pay employees, and keep their practices open. A 2011 MedPAC survey found that 2% of Medicare patients reported having big problems finding a physician. That may not sound like a lot, but previous surveys showed patients having relatively few, if any, problems. In addition, a 2008 survey done by the Center for Studying Health System Change found that about 14% of physicians accepted no new Medicare patients. And a 2010 survey by the American Medical Association found that 17% of physicians were restricting the number of Medicare patients in their practice. If we fail to find a permanent solution to the SGR, these numbers will only rise, and Medicare patients will not receive the care they need or deserve. Mr. Speaker, the Congress must act to end this uncertainty. I urge my colleagues to support this simple motion to instruct, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Well, I thank the Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we've seen this motion to instruct before, and it calls on the conferees, of which I'm a member, to act, and to do so by February 17th, I believe, is the date that's been suggested. We would like to act. In fact, we await an alternative from the Senate. The conference committee has met, and led by our very capable chairman, Dave Camp of Michigan, we've held, I believe, 3 or 4 open, joint House, Senate, Republican, Democrat conference discussions, meetings, which hadn't happened around here. Certainly in the last Congress, I don't think it ever happened, and we're doing it in the broad daylight, and we've had 4 of those, and our staffs are having some discussions. But you got to go back and understand that the House, under Republican leadership, actually passed a 1-year extension of the unemployment benefits. The House, Republican-led, passed a 2-year doc fix, which meant for seniors who are on Medicare, that the physicians they rely so much on for their health care, that those physicians would continue to be able to afford to see them and not face a 27.4% cut in the reimbursement rates. Now, here's the deal, that we passed that, and we funded it, and we did it for 2 years. Not 2 months, 2 years. We did the payroll tax, as it's called by my friends on the other side of the aisle, payroll tax, middle-class tax, working American tax cut for a full year. Now, there's a debate about whether that should be offset or not, because our party has said, you know, when we reduce the tax burden on hardworking middle-class Americans, families and job creators, we shouldn't have to go raise somebody else's taxes to do that. Now, the difference on this is we're talking about Social Security taxes. This is about reducing the amount of money that you and I, and Mr. Speaker, you and I pay into Social Security, and every working American that pays into Social Security. We're saying you get to reduce how much you pay into Social Security by this 2%. Now, those of us on this side of the aisle believe that the Social Security Trust Fund has been raided once too many times by both parties over time, but that should stop. And so if we're going to reduce how much goes into Social Security, we should offset that somehow so that the fund is not drained. And that can be done in a multitude of ways, but it should be done. Because otherwise, it's less money going in to the Social Security Trust Fund. And I think we'd all have to admit, as the actuaries do, that in the end of the day, Social Security Trust Fund is not the best funded trust fund on the planet. And we're going to need to do some work to secure the retirement of future generations in Social Security. So, back to the point here, the House passed all that. We did a 1-year payroll tax reduction so that hardworking middle-class Americans would have tax relief. They'd have that extra money in the pocket, and Lord knows they need it, especially when you see what's happened under this president with energy costs. I think gasoline was $1.86 a gallon when President Obama took office, and we know go to the pump somewhere between 3-something and pushing 4 or over 4, depending on where you are in America. You got to have a little extra money just to try and keep up and go take your kids to soccer and go to the school and go to work. It's hard out there. So we passed that, a year extension of that, and a full-year extension on unemployment for those who have, who have struggled in this horrible economy. There have been 11 recessions since World War II, 11 recessions. This is the worst in terms of recovery from a recession. When Ronald Reagan was president, we had a horrible recession in the early 80s. We came out of that recession that if it were the same pace as the process then or now as then, you'd create something like 15 million, 16 million new jobs, which means virtually everybody who's unemployed and still uncounted, because a lot of people have fallen off the unemployment rolls aren't counted. All of them would have jobs if we were growing at the same pace we did when President Reagan was in office and came out of that recession. but we're not. The policies really haven't worked. So-called stimulus that we were told, American taxpayers were told, if it were just passed, somehow unemployment would never get above 8%. Now, $1 trillion+ later with interest payments that the next generation will get to pay back, we're somehow supposed to celebrate unemployment that's dropped to 8.3. Now, I'm glad to see the improvement. I'm glad to see the job gains in the private sector. For goodness sakes, my wife and I have been small business owners since 1986 in Oregon. I understand what it's like to sign the front of a payroll check and the back, and to grow a business, and to deal in good times and bad. But the long and short of it is there's a horrible recession. So coming out of this, we need that bridge. And we put some reforms in unemployment to help people, to lift them up, to give them incentive when they're on out there for a year, year and a half, 2 years, that maybe we can help them get a better education, encourage that, allow states to encourage that, to help them get a GED, because all the data show that if you have a high school diploma, if you have a GED, the odds of you getting hired are much higher. And then we gave the states the opportunity to do drug screening. You know, and I've heard from a lot of employers in my district out in rural Oregon that say, you know, we do drug tests. And, Congressman, you'd be shocked at how many people apply for the job and can't pass the drug test. Well, if you can't pass the drug test, then maybe you really aren't actively seeking work in a way that's legitimate, because you can't get hired and yet you're on unemployment. So why don't we do some sort of screen, figure that problem out you have, and help you then get treatment? And so we said to states, we're going to do away with a federal decision that's, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years old that said states don't have this authority. I think states could actually manage this pretty well. That was in the bill the House passed. So we did all these things. A year reduction in the taxes people pay into Social Security, the payroll tax deduction, a two-year fix for your physicians who treat our families on Medicare. And both of my parents, they're gone now, were on Medicare. My wife's parents, who have also passed away, they were on Medicare. This is an incredibly valuable program. But we passed a 2-year fix for them. And the 1 year for unemployment, the 1 year for the middle-class tax cut. All that went over to the Senate. And this is probably something we can maybe agree on here. What we got back from the other chamber was a 2-month extension of those things. Now, some of us stayed around here when the House said, really, a 2-month when this is a year and 2-year problem? Why don't you appoint some negotiators? And so the Speaker of the House, Mr. Boehner, appointed the negotiators for the House side, and we hoped that the Senate would appoint negotiators. And they didn't. They didn't appoint anybody. In fact, they left town. And eventually, when nobody showed up after we'd been here for a week trying to see if we couldn't bring both sides, the House and the Senate, together, and Republicans and Democrats, and work out something more than a 2-month deal, they wouldn't show. And we ended up passing the 2-month extension, which, by the way, Mr. Speaker, puts us right back where we are right now, which is why we have this motion to instruct from my friends on the other side of the aisle, calling on the conference committee to get its work done by the 17th. So we're for that. In fact, the last time this was voted on here, it was overwhelming. I think there were only 16 no votes in the House. So, I mean, we want to get this done, too. Now, the Republican conferees from the House and the Senate met today, as we've done over the last week or two. The Democrat Senate conferees, by the way, they had a retreat today down at the Nationals ballpark in some meeting room down there. It was a planning retreat. We've helped, both parties have had these in the House. But it just sort of caused a pause in the efforts because the Democrats are all off at a policy retreat today from the Senate. So we weren't able to accomplish much today. But we hope to get something from the Senate. Because, you see, they go into the conference and they had this 2-month effort against our 1 year. And so we can't negotiate against ourselves. So we're waiting for a proposal back from the Senate, which we hope to get soon. And if we do, then tomorrow we'll meet at 10 o'clock, Republicans, Democrats, House, Senate, to try and work this through. We want to get this done. The American people deserve to have us get this done, and we're working on a way to do that. So I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I just yield myself 1 minute for a couple of quick comments with respect so that we all have the same set of facts. We all have the same set of facts. The Senate conferees were appointed on December 23rd, the very same day that the provision that we're talking about passed the House by unanimous consent. The conference committee did not meet until the 27th of January for the first time. That's one. Two, we talk about the Reagan recession. The Reagan recession was nowhere near as severe as the, let's call it, the Bush recession. The GDP, fourth quarter of 2008, declined at a rate of over 8%, annual decline of over 8%, most severe recession we've had since the Great Depression. Jobs lost. Last 14 months of the Bush administration, we lost jobs every single month, culminating in his last month in office, a job loss of 735,000 jobs. President Obama has been president for 36 months. We've had job growth, private sector job growth, in 23 of those months. Drug testing, one comment. Over 400,000 Americans have lost their jobs in the last 3 years as a result of corporations outsourcing. I'll yield myself another 30 seconds. Outsourcing jobs to other countries. So these are people who lost their jobs, ready, willing, and able to do them, lost their jobs as a result of really corporations unrelentingly pursuing profits at the expense of middle-class Americans. Do we really want to add insult to injury and tell them that if they need unemployment, that they're going to have to be drug tested? I yield 3 minutes to my friend from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
The gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. The major reason why this motion to instruct is timely is the answer to this question. What will we know after February 17th that we don't know now? There's going to be no new information. So what would justify the delay? What we know now, number one, is that Republican economists and Democratic economists say that this is a very fragile recovery. That we're all happy that the unemployment rate is going down, but we're all concerned that it's unacceptably too high. And when you have Republican and Democratic aligned economists saying unanimously to take this money out of the economy at this time would stall the recovery, we all agree that we can't do that. So that's not going to change between now and February 17th. Secondly, we know that on the pay for, we have clear lines of division on this. If you have a pay for that basically takes with one hand what was given in the other. In other words, you cut spending on things that help middle-class families and then to pay for a 2% reduction in their payroll tax. That zeroes out the stimulative effect. So from a macroeconomic point of view, it does no good for the economy when all of us assert that our goal is to help the economy. The second question is political tactics, and the political tactic of this Congress has been brinksmanship. In December 10, when we just about turned out the lights on government, it was a last-minute agreement that finally kept them on. It included a tax provision that extended the high-income tax cuts, added $800 billion to the deficit, but created some significant anxiety in the markets as to whether this institution could do its job. Fast forward, August of 11, in the fiasco, that's the only word that can be used, of this House of Representatives actually having a debate about whether it was legitimate for the people of this country to not pay their bills. That caused enormous anxiety in the markets. By the way, that hurts the economy. December of last year, we were in the payroll tax fight. And this is where I think we get to the heart of the matter. There's a difference of opinion on the payroll tax. The Democratic side is essentially for it. It was very clear the Republicans were against it, and it was kicking and dragging when the Speaker came back with the unanimous consent and overrode the action that had previously been taken. So the reality of the situation we're in now is that the other side is saying yes, 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 they're for a payroll tax reduction. But their actions say no way, no way, no way. It's time to act. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask how much time remains on each side?
Yes. The gentleman from Oregon has 21 minutes. Gentleman from New York has 17.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve. I think he may have another speaker.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 3 minutes from the gentleman to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for yielding. Mr. Speaker,
Microphone.
Thankfully, we're in a leap year because we have 2 weeks to the day to come to an agreement to extend the payroll tax cut, the doc fix, and the important unemployment benefits. We can't let taxes go up to the American people by $100 billion. Let's get this clear, what this costs. Yet the majority is willing to bail out certain banks, protect billionaires by having their taxes go up by 1 dime, has to be dragged kicking and screaming to provide the middle class a little help. And the gentleman from New York was absolutely correct. To compare what the Reagan administration faced, and I thought they did a good job in responding to the problem, to this almost catastrophe off the cliff is a stretch beyond one's imagination. It doesn't stand up to logic. So far this year, the economic indicators have shown some improvements. Not what you would like, not what I would like, not what the gentleman from Long Island would like, but we're going in the right direction. I'm sorry if some folks on the other side don't like that, but that's what's happening. We've had 23 months of private sector job growth. Increases in manufacturing, not since the early 90s, mid-90s, on manufacturing. When the President raised his hand in January of 2009, we were losing 750,000 jobs a month. Now the unemployment rate dropped to 8.3%, nowhere where either side wants it to be. But however, the failure to pass a payroll tax cut would put the brakes on our economic growth by reducing our gross domestic product by $28 billion off the bat. The recovery is still fragile. And the states, including my home state of New Jersey, have an above-average unemployment rate. Unfortunately, the failure to pass an extension would also hurt New Jersey more than almost every other state. First, folks living in Bergen County, they lose $1,400. Now, that may not seem alike if you're paying a tax rate of 13.9%, hint, hint, but it is a significant amount of money directly in the pockets of the middle-class families in northern New Jersey. Nationwide, failure to pass an extension would reduce employment by $350,000. And you're saying we all agree, Mr. Speaker, we all agree that this payroll tax cut is a good thing. But we disagree profoundly as to how we're going to pay for this. And I know it's tough for you to come to the well to find places to pay for since you didn't pay for anything. Between 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Thank you.
I yield the gentleman additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In New Jersey, this means that the construction industry would lose over $100 billion in sales. Manufacturing would lose $285 million in sales. And the real estate professionals would lose $159 million in sales. Overall, there'd be a reduction over 11,000 jobs. This is totally unacceptable. The answer to job creation and economic growth is in front of our faces. Help the middle class grow with tax relief, smart investments now. Put it in context. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from New York.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oregon.
I yield myself such time as I may consume, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman is recognized.
I want to just address a couple of points. First of all, my dear friend from New Jersey, when he talks about the Congress bailing out the banks, he may want to talk to his colleague from New York, since I think he voted for TARP in that process. So, anyway, he may want to have that discussion right there. You two are pretty close together. You can kind of work that deal out. I want to talk about markets anxiety, because we heard
gentleman yield.
Not at the moment, but go ahead. Yeah, I'll yield to you, sir.
Well, You know, we were all in on this, for good or for bad, and we could level the same criticisms about bailing out the auto industry. Some banks took advantage of it, played it straight, and some did not.
Reclaiming my time, I
Sure.
don't disagree with that. I didn't support some of those bailouts either, although I did vote to make sure that our financial system didn't collapse. My point is we faced some tough problems. We actually got over the hump in a bipartisan way, and we can do that here. And the interesting thing is that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are the ones who, I believe, in most cases, voted against the long-term payroll tax reduction that Republicans put forward. They voted against the one-year extension of unemployment, and the two-year doc fix. Well, just a minute. I got a couple other things I was going to share with you first. So, I mean, that's what the House passed, right? And so what we got back from the Senate was the 2-month short term that we're all upset about. Because I agree with you. As, having been a small business owner, there were a couple of things that were bad about that 2-month extension, which actually we, in the end, tweaked and fixed. And one is just doing the payroll. Trying to get the formulas, the calculations, the software in your payroll system, all that had to be changed for employers. We actually got that fixed at the end, which is a good thing. Going forward, we need long-term predictability and certainty. And that's what Republicans thought and the Speaker Boehner thought in the beginning was, why don't we stop kicking these cans down the road on short terms and get away from these problems that were such an issue last year that riled the markets, as one of our colleagues said earlier. Why were we forced into this mess with the short-term continuing resolutions that time and again we came right up to the brink on? Why? Because under Speaker Pelosi, my friends on the other side of the aisle did not produce a budget, nor did they fund the agencies for the full fiscal year.
The gentleman yields.
No, I won't. Not at this moment. Don't leave. I'll get to you. I got to just finish this because this is the problem of the dysfunctional nature of what happened here in Congress 2 years ago, which then, when we took the majority in January of last year, we inherited. No budget, just like our colleagues on the other side have not produced a budget in more than 1,000 days. They still haven't produced a budget. If you and I were on a board of directors of some nonprofit and we didn't do a budget every year, they'd rightfully say you're being malfeasant. You're not doing your job. So the House passed a budget. The House, under Speaker Boehner, also funded the government. Now, it wasn't easy, but we only have a majority on a good day in a third of the process. So we had to work with our friends on the other side and the president downtown. At the end of the day, though, we funded the government for the rest of the fiscal year. Now, you talk about anxiety in the markets and all that. By the way, having brought some stability back to government, having seriously said we have to pay for spending and cuts by cutting spending, the market now is at the highest level it's been since the crash in '08 or thereabouts. So it is coming back. Now, that doesn't help the average Joe out there on the street necessarily, people trying to find work. And there's been a lot of effort to try and deal with that, but we got a long way to go, and I agree with my colleague. None of us is happy with 8.3. None of us was really happy at 10, or in parts of my district, 16% unemployment. So we have a long way to go. I would yield just briefly.
I would agree with much of what you're saying, and we need a bipartisan solution.
Yes, sir.
The problem is you failed to mention that how you pay for this is what really caused the disagreement, whether it was August or even December. Even December, go back to December, when we had another opportunity, and we did not rise to that occasion. If you are not willing to at least come together and compromise on how you pay for these things, I know it's a difficult thing, and I respect the integrity of your words and yourself when I say this through the
Speaker. Yes,
through the Speaker. I say this wholeheartedly and full-heartedly. If we can't agree on how we're going to pay for the payroll tax cut, because you look at what you've suggested. You're suggesting that we go deeper into the general budget and cut things that are near and dear to not only yourself.
I'm going to reclaim my time because you actually have time, and you might want to yield.
Thank you.
Get some yielded on that. The point is that's the discussion we are having right now is how to pay for it. That is the discussion we're having with the Senate, and there is disagreement. But there should be no misunderstanding that it was the Republican House that put forward the one-year extension of the payroll tax cut for these same working-class folks. It was the Republican House that put forward a two-year fix for the docs so they had certainty in their medical practices and could continue to see seniors on Medicare. And it was the House that passed the one-year extension on unemployment. We just think the spend it even when you don't have it days are over. This country's job outlook is affected because of this country's government's failure to cut spending. We don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. There's nothing that has a longer chance of living in America than a government program created in Washington. We have got to do a better job. It's not easy. The hardest thing you can do in this job is tell somebody no. But you know what? For too many times, too many people in this chamber over the years have only said yes to spending and creating new programs. That has to change. And so we did have a debate about increasing the debt ceiling, and for the first time, we said it's not going to be that automatic Democratic Dick Gephardt rule that said when you pass a budget, you raise the debt ceiling automatically. We thought it's time to have the debate, as painful as it was, as difficult as it was, to say we have to offset this increase in deficit by cutting spending. Because I know as a small business owner, we would have been broke in our small business if it had been run as this government runs. Now, there are good times and bad times in government, and you can work around some level of borrowing and some level of deficit, but it isn't far from this porch out here to the debt crisis Greece has, and Portugal has, and the European countries have and are facing right now. We have time to fix that, and that's why we're saying rather than cut the funding going into Social Security and not replace it with something else is a mistake. That's what we're saying. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yield myself 30 seconds before I yield to Mr. Andrews. The gentleman referenced my vote on TARP. I did indeed vote for TARP. Found myself in pretty good company. Mr. Cantor voted for TARP. Mr. Boehner voted for TARP. And with that, I will yield 3 minutes to my friend from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized. Without objection. How much time are you requesting?
Three minutes.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from New York for this opportunity. We got some welcome economic news last Friday that companies added about 250,000 private sector jobs. It's long overdue, and we hope and pray that it continues for many, many months to come. The country is coming back, but we have a very long way to go. And I think one of the reasons that the country is coming back is that at the beginning of 2011, everybody who earns a wage in this country got a fairly substantial tax cut, so they would buy more in the stores and maybe eat a little bit in the restaurants and buy more goods and services. And it and some other things, I think, started to work. The worst thing that we could do would be to interrupt that recovery by failing to extend this tax relief for middle-class Americans. And I'm willing to take at face value. I think almost everyone in this House agrees with that proposition. And I think everyone agrees with the proposition that it would do great harm to our economy not to make this happen. Here's what I think stands in the way of where we are and where we need to get to. In any negotiation, you can't succeed by negotiation through ultimatum. There's some things that I really think ought to happen. I frankly think the way to pay for this is a very small tax surcharge on the very wealthiest Americans. I think that those who make more than $1 million a year, who've gotten, by the way, 90% of the pay increases in this country over the last decade, I think asking them to contribute to deficit reduction is a fair and reasonable thing to do. I think it's what we should do. But I don't think we should make it an ultimatum. And I don't think our party is making it an ultimatum. The problem here, as I see it, is that the last time we went around on this one-year extension, we heard from the other side two very important matters that I think are rather extraneous to solving this problem. The first had the functional effect of a cut in unemployment benefits. Now, at a time when there are 4 unemployed Americans for every 1 open job, I think to presume that the unemployed are lazy or not working hard to find a job is really Just factually incorrect and frankly indefensible. So we don't agree with extending this recovery by cutting the unemployment benefits of people out there looking for work. We just don't think that's a good idea. And then the other ultimatum came on the issue of the pipeline, and there's all different views on the pipeline, some pro, some con, within both parties. I hope that what we're able to do is stop the negotiation by ultimatum and extend this for the rest of the year, and the purpose of Mr. Bishop's amendment needs to be looked at. There is no good reason why this can't be done by the 17th of February. Frankly, it should have been done by the 17th of January. Now, we all made this decision at the end of December. There was no reason this couldn't have been done in the month of January, but here we are. When the American people have a dispute in their family, in their business, at the labor negotiation table, at their school board, no matter where they are, they do not negotiate by ultimatum. Neither should the Congress. And frankly, when I heard from the other side in December that we must do the pipeline or no extension of the tax cut, you know, we must cut unemployment benefits or no extension of the tax cut, that's no way to run the country. That's not what we ought to do. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How much time is left for each side?
Gentleman from Oregon has 13.5 minutes. Gentleman from New York has 10.5 minutes.
All right, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I'd like to just point out a couple of things so we get on the same terms here. I was actually here till the 23rd day of December, as were the Republicans appointed to be conferees. I don't know that Leader Pelosi had appointed Democrat conferees at that point. I don't think in that process she had yet, although she did somewhere thereafter, maybe on the 23rd, but not in between. The Senate wasn't here, and even though we tried to get them to appoint conferees prior to that, they weren't. And so on the 23rd is when we finally said it's over. They weren't coming back, and we ended up agreeing to the 2-month extension, which leads us to here. Now, my friend from New Jersey talked about this should have been done by January 17th. Well, there's only one problem with that. The Senate didn't come back into session until the 24th of January. Now, the conferees could have met during that period, and in fact, we would have met during that period, but frankly, there were members probably from both parties and both houses who were not available to meet, and I know for sure in the Senate, some of the conferees were not available to meet because they weren't exactly in the country. So that wasn't going to happen until we were both back in session. Now, I believe the State of the Union was Tuesday night, the 24th. I believe that's the day the Senate came back. I may be off by a day, but that's why this thing didn't start up, which, by the way, is why in December we begged the Senate, why don't we work this out December 23rd? Why don't we work this out December 22nd, 21st, 19th, 8th? Go on back. We were ready, and we stayed. And they chose not to, and they had a big vote. And said, we're going to do 2 months. We'll see you at the end of January.
Will the gentleman yield?
Here's where we are, and I yield.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Is the gentleman asserting that the Senate was in recess until January 24th?
I believe it was.
That means the gentleman must support President Obama's appointments to the Labor Board.
Well, I reclaim my time. That's cute and clever. That's not, you know and I know, that's not exactly the same issue. And I would assert that if a different president, a different party had done that, you might share the same concern some of us have, that we were not officially in recess, but they were not in town. We were not in recess, but they were not in town either. Both chambers open and close every 3 days. It's how it's done past. I reserve balance my time.
Gentleman from New York.
Yield myself 30 seconds before I yield 3 minutes to Mr. Rothman, just for,
gentleman is recognized.
again, so that we all have the same set of facts. It's my understanding that the chairman of the conference committee, Mr. Camp, was on a CODEL to South Africa during the period, South America, pardon me, during the period of time that the gentleman from Oregon cites, and it is up to the chairman of the conference committee to call the conference. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Rothman.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from New York for the time. Mr. Speaker, this matter of whether to extend the payroll tax for middle-class Americans for 160 Americans is a no-brainer for most Americans. It has to be done. 160 Americans should get a tax increase because the Republicans don't want to share the sacrifice of cutting spending and balancing our budget? We have to pay the sins of the Republican majority who want to balance the American budget on the backs of working-class Americans, seniors, veterans, and the middle class? That makes no sense. It's not right. Now, my colleague from the other side of the aisle says, well, the Democrats want to take money from Social Security to pay for this. That's not true, Mr. Speaker. In my opinion, that is obviously not true. This is from a party, Mr. Speaker, that wanted to privatize Social Security.
Well, the gentleman
The Republicans wanted to privatize Social Security, and everyone knows it.
Well,
the Republicans just voted, I'm not going to yield, the Republicans just voted last year to end Medicare. So the American people are not fooled about whose side the Republicans are on and whose side the Democrats are on, Mr. Speaker. The Democrats are for working people, for American middle class, for seniors, for veterans, for labor. So the Republicans say, Mr. Speaker, that they want 160 million Americans to have their payroll taxes go up. They want 50 million senior citizens in America to be threatened with the loss of health care because they're going to deny the doctors who treat the seniors full reimbursement for their treatments. And they want to cut unemployment benefits that puts food on the table for tens of millions of Americans who are out there looking for work because the Republicans do not want to share the sacrifice. They want to cut spending on the backs of the middle class, working Americans, and seniors. They voted to privatize Social Security. They voted to end Medicare. Who's anybody kidding when they say that this bill to extend unemployment benefits, to keep the payroll tax cut for 160 million Americans, and to keep seniors having doctors care for them because the doctors will still get full Medicare reimbursement, has anything to do with seniors? The Democrats are for the seniors, Social Security and Medicare, and everyone knows that. It is time for our Republican colleagues, I'm a Democrat who voted against TARP and for the car company bailout, to get their priorities straight. Vote for this continuation of unemployment benefits, for unemployment insurance, and full payment to doctors who take care of millions of our nation's seniors.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Yeah, well, Mr. Speaker, I yield my such time as I may consume to set the record straight. First of all, it was my colleague who just spoke party who raided Medicare as part of the President's health care legislation by $500 billion. That's a fact. Now, when he says that my party ended Medicare, that is not a fact. And in fact, Political Fact Check, the independent arbiter of what we all say here to see if it's truthful, said that the notion that that is true is the biggest untruth of the year. They gave it that award because they knew it wasn't true. And I know it's not true. Now, I guess I'm trying to figure out what my friend, and he is my friend, means when he said that this isn't somehow raiding Social Security's trust fund, because the payroll tax that's at issue here that is being reduced by 2% is the payment that, if it were made, would go into Social Security. That's the payroll tax.
If the gentleman would yield.
I won't at this moment. You wouldn't yield to me. I'll let you use your folks' time. That's what's being, now, that is being offset. And by the way, the offsets that we are talking about as part of this legislation almost in every case received bipartisan support in this House, and sometimes overwhelming bipartisan support. And many of those offsets were actually recommended by the President of the United States, Mr. Obama, as part of a different package, as things he thought made sense. And so we said, well, you know what, maybe there's some common ground here. The President recommended some of these offsets as ways to reduce government spending and pay for other things as part of the supercommittee process. And so if he thought it was okay there, maybe we can finally find some common ground and we'll say, okay, you like that there, so okay, we'll use that here so that we don't increase the deficit, don't hurt jobs, and don't leave our kids with an unimaginable debt. So Republicans are the ones who have said, we're not going to let you raid Social Security. We'll reduce the payroll tax payment, the Social Security tax payment, but we're going to offset it so that the fund is not any further reduced, because I think that's an important principle I would hope we would all share. And so I just say that it was the President's health care plan that took $500 billion out of Medicare, I don't know. I'm a fan of Medicare. I've seen what it does for seniors. I saw what it did for my parents and my wife's parents. And I want to make sure it's preserved in the future, just like I want to make sure Social Security is as well. That's why we shouldn't rob the fund. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yield myself 30 seconds. Two quick comments.
Gentleman is recognized.
I don't know a single Democrat, not a single one, who believes that we should diminish the Social Security Trust Fund to handle this Social Security payroll tax reduction. We all believe that it should, the Social Security Trust Fund should be held harmless. Secondly, with respect to Medicare, the Affordable Care Act does indeed reduce the rate of growth of Medicare going forward by $500 billion. I will point out that every single Republican in this chamber voted for that very same reduction in the rate of growth when they voted for the Ryan budget. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my friend. We are here as stewards of our nation, and we must be here to care for the people of our nation, to care for those who are working hard every day, trying to survive, trying to pay their mortgages, trying to pay their car payments, get their kids in school. And all they're looking for, 160 million Americans, is a continuation of a tax cut. We should be for that. Those millions who are unemployed are also looking for help. They're looking for recognition that they've earned these unemployment benefits. This isn't welfare. It's an earned benefit, unemployment insurance. We should make sure they get that benefit. Now, why do they need that? It's pretty obvious. People have to pay their mortgages or their rent. They have to feed their families, have to put clothes on their kids' backs. They need this unemployment insurance. I have trouble understanding, Mr. Speaker, this proposal that's before the Congress in this bill, H.R. 3630, that would discriminate against Americans who are unemployed, who don't have a high school diploma, by saying if you're going to get unemployment benefits, you have to go to school. Well, that sounds good, but then it doesn't give them any resource to do so. This sounds too much like urging people to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and then stealing their boots. We should give people unemployment benefits, and if they have time because they don't have a job to go to school, we should be paying for that as well. That helps to uplift the knowledge level in America, and then when our economy comes back, we'll have a better trained workforce. Now, this other proposal that would allow states to subject all of those who apply for unemployment insurance to drug tests needs to be looked at. Could I have another minute? Is that possible?
30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for 30
Has anybody
seconds.
in this Congress suggested that those who are getting a bailout should take a drug test? That those who have oil depletion allowances should take a drug test? That those who were the recipients of the Bush tax cuts in the top bracket should take a drug test? No. We say the poorest of the poor should be subject to drug tests. I mean, come on, get real. We need to create jobs in this economy. And there's one way to do it. We could create 7 million jobs debt-free with what's called the NEAT Act, National Employment Emergency Defense Act. Government needs to create these jobs debt-free. We don't have to have the unemployment level we have. We shouldn't be having this debate.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman is recognized.
You know what Americans really want is a job. And I don't think there's any disagreement between us that that should be our goal. That's why, as part of what the Republicans put in the bill that went to the Senate, is a plan to auction off spectrum that would generate upwards of 700,000 jobs, according to some studies. 700,000 jobs, spur innovation, spur technology. That's in this bill that we're fighting for. Because this is a sector that can grow good-paying family jobs, can keep America in the lead on innovation and technology. So the legislation, the American Jobs Act, which I authored, is in this legislation. It's a part of this bill. It would generate net $16.7 billion to help pay for extending unemployment or to help pay the Social Security Trust Fund so that it doesn't have to be depleted. Mr. Speaker, I yield such time as he may consume to Mr. Reed.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my good friend from Oregon for yielding me this time. Mr. Speaker, I have sat on this conference committee now for a bunch of months, and there's been a lot of money spent in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere around this nation saying that the Republican Party is the party you know. Well, let me tell you, as I sat in this conference committee, what I have heard, and yesterday was the best example of it, I heard common sense proposals in the House bill brought to the conference committee, brought to the Senate Democrats, and said, look, we have all supported this. 90% of these pay-fors for the policies that we're trying to enact, the President, the Democratic President, supports. And what I heard repeatedly yesterday was, no, no, no. We are not going to accept these pay-fors. Even though our President said we'll accept them, even though we have supported them in the past, what I heard yesterday was, no, we're not going to pay for it. So I think to the American people, there is a clear division here. What we stand for on the House Republican side and in this chamber is that we are going to pay for the decisions coming out of Washington, D.C. going forward. And I will have to say that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and my particular colleagues in the Senate on the Democratic side of the aisle, have tried to go back to the old politics of, you know what, let's just call everything emergency spending and we don't have to pay for it. That's old school politics. That philosophy is done and over with. Because the American hardworking taxpayers back at home, Mr. Speaker, deserve for us to pay our bills. And that is what we're doing. And I am all for true dialogue. If the Senate is not going to accept the pay-fors that are in the House bill, then send over whatever proposals you have to cover this bill, especially when we're talking about Social Security taxes, when we're talking about payroll taxes that are the sole revenue to fund Social Security. I've had so many constituents back at home, Mr. Speaker, that have repeatedly told me, why are you cutting these taxes? Why are you jeopardizing Social Security? And what I have said to them is, I believe that you need to keep your money, not give it to Washington and let them waste and spend it on policies that are out of here. But what we will do is I will stand and make sure that Social Security is made whole. And that's what I'm looking for in this dialogue, is that we come together, recognize that the politics of old is done, and we will pay for our decisions. And once that happens, I am confident we can come together and do what hardworking taxpayers in America want us to do, that is extend the payroll, take care of the unemployment, and take care of our doctors so that physicians can see our seniors in America and that Medicare is preserved. With that, I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York yields back.
And I reserve.
Gentleman from Oregon reserves his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to my friend from Michigan, Mr. Peters.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise today in support of Representative Bishop's Democratic motion to instruct conferees. If Congress doesn't act by the end of the month, Americans that have lost their jobs through no fault of their own will begin losing the unemployment benefits, keeping their family afloat in these very difficult times. This is why I'm leading my colleagues in sending a letter to the Conference Committee urging them to preserve current levels of unemployment benefits. Families receiving unemployment benefits are already facing significant challenges, and pulling the rug out from underneath them would damage our economy and force these Americans into poverty. Mr. Speaker, my Republican colleagues like to talk about uncertainty. When they're not pushing tax cuts for the rich as a cure-all for the economy, they're blaming uncertainty supposedly created by Wall Street reform or environmental protections for slow economic growth. If my Republican colleagues want to know what real uncertainty is, I suggest they pick up the phone the next time one of their constituents who is staring down the expiration of their unemployment benefits calls. Real uncertainty is not knowing if you're able to pay for heat. Real uncertainty is not knowing if you're not able to pay for groceries. Real uncertainty means spending a year or more looking for a job and barely scraping by with unemployment benefits while some in Washington want to play politics with the livelihood of these Americans. Uncertainty is exactly what Republicans are creating by their refusal to come to the table and pass a full extension of unemployment benefits and the payroll tax cut. I support Representative Bishop's motion to instruct conferees because it will direct conference committee members to stop delay and issue the report next week. American families cannot afford to wait any longer. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized. Gentleman from Oregon has 4.5 minutes. Gentleman from New York has 2 minutes.
I'll reserve for the moment.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close. Will you close, or do you have another speaker?
I don't know. Do you want to say? And who ends up being